Deltarune chapters 3 and 4 for the first time made me so excited it was almost unpleasant. I bought them as soon as they released and wanted somewhere quiet and air-conditioned to play them, but I needed to plug in my Switch, so I ended up lying in a dog bed in my basement next to a power outlet all day and then went to bed extremely sore. Anyways, I like the chapters and they also rewrote my brain in the way I think about Deltarune. Chapters 1 and 2 seemingly established a hard formula that we understandably replicated in our predictions. You know, there's a main boss and a secondary antagonist and a secret boss, and you progress through the Dark Worlds linearly from left to right. Sure, chapter 3 might be a little silly, but 4 will be a much more standard chapter. My ass. And it's great, it's great. The breaking of formula meant that certain predictions I'd gotten attached to didn't come true, but that doesn't mean I think the way things turned out is worse, and it was also cool to see where my ideas turned out to be more accurate. More importantly, I need to spill every single initial thought I have about these chapters right now, so this will be a more casual, somewhat disjointed video about my thoughts and reactions and how my views on things have changed. Most people prefer 4 to 3, but I actually liked them about equally. I think 3 served as a good transitional chapter between 2 and 4. It's very silly, but it combines that humor with sadder themes of loss and nostalgia more than chapter 2 does for a lot of its runtime. The different gameplay is a welcome change and supports the themes of overindulgence and escapism. The exploration of Ralsei and Susie's characters and their relationship is excellent and necessary for kickstarting Ralsei's arc. Tenna is wonderful. His manic emotional instability has captivated me, and while I wasn't really vibing with the TV head twink in a suit design when it was first revealed, him being 3D and super animated was a really good choice and actually really redeemed that for me. Also, the rules subplot is possibly the funniest thing in the entire game. Obviously, it was quite different than I thought it would be. I made a video discussing how I thought not only that Toriel would be important and have a character arc, but that Asgore would come to the Dark World as well, only for neither of them to have a single line. It's really a chapter about Kris's experiences, not the whole family's. And these chapters definitely continue to evidence the problems in Kris's parental relationships. Asgore is nice to them, but doesn't seem especially close with them as he's focused on other plot things and keeps naively and inappropriately thinking he can get Toriel back to everyone's discomfort. Toriel drinks away her problems, leading her to basically forget about Kris all night. To be fair, Sans also isn't that much better than her in that scene, even if Kris isn't his kid. Yes, the dancing scene is very funny and cute, but it's certainly not appropriate to be that drunk in front of your child, and the surrounding context is that, like, Kris and Susie went through hell thinking they were saving Toriel, only for her to instead be partying at home, making Susie leave uncomfortably and Kris goes straight to bed. I'm not saying Toriel is a literal alcoholic. That term technically refers to the most extreme ends of the alcohol abuse spectrum, but we do know that when she does drink, she's very irresponsible with it. My point is, I feel Kris's parents are still being set up for character arcs one way or another, especially seeing as Asgore is plot relevant to the whole thing going on with Carol and Des, and Chapter 5 is probably definitely Flower King. I think part of the reason that a character arc for Toriel or Asgore, or even just more exploration of the relationship between Kris and Tenna wouldn't have worked in Chapter 3 is because those things would require them to have a lot more autonomy than they currently do. Kind of unexpected that they didn't like Tenna, by the way. Before this chapter came out, I thought they would be like all in on the nostalgia, but I think they dislike him for similar reasons to not liking Ralsei at first. Like, Ralsei pretends everything's fine when it's not, and Tenna does the same thing because he doesn't know that Kris's life went to shit, and in general, I think Kris has a rather bitter relationship with their past. Excitingly, we can see Kris resisting our control more and more. For instance, if we tell Ralsei, of course not, when he asks if it's okay for him to be himself, they yawn during the not. If you tell Susie they'll never play piano again, I think just in the weird route, they bite their hand to avoid saying it, which sounds funny if you haven't seen this interaction, but it's not. It's also really nice that they seem to be liking Ralsei a lot more now. I think him expressing vulnerability about his role as a Darkner and his fears about the prophecy made Kris empathize with him and feel less like he was opposed to their autonomy. Speaking of, everyone who didn't like Ralsei before this owes me $20. In general, I think it's clearer now that Undertale characters will have roles to play in Deltarune, even if they're not main characters. Some people were previously quick to reject theories about certain concepts or characters that don't seem to be a major focus being quote-unquote important, but there's room in between being super important and being irrelevant. You know, subplots are a thing. Sans and Toriel are a subplot. Berdly's festival shenanigans will probably be a subplot. Alvin's insecurities and relationship with his father was a subplot. And with the old man's existence, the Flower King Dark World likely, and the strange Undertale references in Chapter 3's secret boss quest, it seems like Undertale, or more likely its characters, are going to be a bit more important than they have been so far. I was pretty surprised though that Undyne turned out to be a major plot device. Like, Susie and Kris don't know her that well personally. It's unclear if Gerson was close with Undyne in Deltarune, but he was her mentor in Undertale, and of course he shares her leitmotif in Soul Mode. So I wonder if any kind of relationship between Susie and Undine will be explored due to that connection. To get some positions out of the way, I definitely think Kris is talking to Carol on the phone, assuming Carol is the only person on the phone, but they're also clearly working with the Knight. There's a lot of small details that imply this. They refuse to turn the doorknob in the church, refuse to think of the Knight in chapter 4, and the Knight literally knights them instead of swooning them during the scripted loss at the end of chapter 3's secret boss fight. Whatever Kris is up to, it's apparent that they love their friends. I think the end of chapter 4 very much visually presents them as being torn between Susie and by extension defying the ending of the prophecy and this promise that they made, which based on secret content like the eggs seems to be a promise to help Des because they were or feel responsible for what happened to her. I won't go too deep into this right now, but I am leaning towards them actually having some culpability in her disappearance. Culpability they should forgive themselves for, but I don't think they were blameless. With the chapter 2 pie fake out and the possession plotline, a lot of Deltarune fans, including myself, have been very defensive that Kris is a victim and not a bad person, and that still holds up, but the chapter 4 egg sequence and chapter 3 secret boss quest brings some new implications to the table. Kris going to therapy in the past definitely has to do with some repressed trauma, but there's also the line, right, this is where we draw pictures and don't kill each other, that points towards them perhaps having violent urges, although probably ones they feel guilty for considering the emphasis of washing their hands, never being able to wash it all away. Eram has that line, without play the knife grows dull, and in the Weird Root taunts Kris about having enjoyed yesterday knowing they could say it wasn't really them, and they're quite explicitly talking to Kris and not the player here. Kris absolutely hates the Weird Root and tries to resist it. It's not something they would ever do on their own, and this entire quest constantly questions whether or not Kris is actually having fun. But the game is definitely pushing this idea that they have the capacity for harm, one that they are themselves afraid of, and I don't think we should ignore that. Speaking of Des, while the Knight's identity is definitely meant to be a little ambiguous between her and Carol, I'm pretty sure it's her. I think most people agree on this, but the most prominent evidence is that the Knight has baseball motifs, and there isn't really any time for Carol to scold Noelle and then run to the church to make a fountain without Kris and Susie seeing her. I expected Carol to be intimidating, but I was really surprised by just how sinister she was portrayed. Like, that evil grin. Is she lovely when you get to know her, Asgore? Is she? Obviously, she's going to be nuanced and already is. Des's loss definitely impacted her greatly and either started or intensified her need to preserve everything, but God, she's a bad mother. I do predict that since her theme is just called C, she'll get a fuller one, perhaps actually called Carol, as we learn more about her. We also have her dialogue at the end of chapter 4's Weird Root. I really hope she doesn't understand what's actually going on. For now, I'm going to dance around the specifics of to what extent Kris is working with both the Knight and Carol and what those three's purpose actually is, and the fucking codes, because I have no idea yet, and that's something for the corkboard people to work out. I'm not keen to that particular level of theorizing, but props to those who are. That being said, while there may be evidence to the contrary, I will say that it doesn't feel right for Carol to be working directly with Des. It kind of seems like she's trying to save her, and it's just kind of odd for, like, the rebellious daughter figure and the strict, overbearing mother figure to be completely on the same page in this story. So since Des is very wraith-like, doesn't speak, and is perhaps not entirely herself anymore, I wonder if Carol is actually influencing her actions in a parallel to us and Kris, not necessarily puppeting her to the degree that we are with Kris, but maybe Carol's trying to control her in some way in an effort to eventually save her, whatever that entails. Moving on, I really love that the consequences for being violent keep growing. Chapter 2 had a lot of characters that are always recruited, like Queen, Swatch, and the Sweet Cap'n Cakes, but I think in 3 and 4, La Nino and El Nina are the only required ones. While you can't fight Jackenstein, he does die if you attack other Darkners in 4, and Tenna stays broken if you don't recruit Darkners to fix him, which I was not expecting. That's a pretty big consequence, like it throws his whole arc and resolution out the window. I also really like that you're heavily encouraged to give him to Mettaton because while you might like to keep him in Castletown, saying goodbye and making good on Susie's promise is what makes him happiest, and he doesn't exist just for us. I saw Painted Hen on Twitter suggest that Mettaton could end up leaving the house fused with the TV as his new body, which, you know, I don't think Tenna would mind that much. On a related note, the conflict between Susie and Ralsei over Darkner's personhood and Ralsei not telling her things was everything I wanted and more, and it's also a great setup for the eventual reveal that Kris is possessed and also working with the Knight when they're not possessed, because I think Susie might not take that quite as well. Like, Ralsei agreed to be more honest with her, and now she has to deal with this shit too from the one person she never would have been suspicious of. Her whole conversation with Noelle while Kris is beating us up in the closet is all about how her view of Kris is conflated with their possession, which she doesn't find strange, while Noelle, who's known them longer, does. Her friendship with Kris is real, but I think she might doubt that when she finds out the truth. I think Susie is being not a lot, but just a tad hypocritical about not telling the truth, because she's also trying to prevent others from knowing about and getting involved in Dark Worlds, whether that be Noelle, who I imagine she wouldn't mind rejoining them at this point, or Berdly, even though they could potentially heal his arm in the violent route, or not telling anyone that Undyne was kidnapped. It's good that she and Noelle genuinely bond when at her house, but Susie is still being dishonest about her reasons for coming over. None of these are entirely unreasonable courses of action to take considering the circumstances, but I wonder if any of it will be called into question. People have suggested a lot of different ideas about how the girl in the prophecy might not be Susie, because the girl wields a sword, people argue she doesn't really look like Susie. A common theory is that it's actually supposed to be Noelle, as Ralsei says Susie's supposed to equip ribbons, Noelle would have gone with Kris to the closet if Susie hadn't shown up, stuff like that. A common extension of that idea I've seen is that the weird route is what happens in the actual prophecy, which I do disagree with because that route is all about breaking the game. The route is constantly begging you to abort it and go back on script, and you're able to erase the natural consequences of your actions up to that point if you do. Noelle will totally forget that you traumatized her. Even in Chapter 4, the game breakiness seems to continue with the scene where the soul isn't able to answer Susie's question and the rain suddenly stops and starts again. Ralsei, who knows about the prophecy, also discourages Snowgrave, saying in that route that taking Noelle to the festival is a bad choice, which is a first for him. You could say that him knowing you're on that route indicates it's in the prophecy since he was hoping to change its ending, but I think the reason he knows something is wrong is because Susie and Noelle getting together is part of the prophecy, and when the Ferris wheel scene doesn't go according to script and he's left in the dark about what happened, and Kris is expressing interest in Noelle, that clues him in that something's wrong. He also mentions in the weird route only his worry that if there's something else outside the prophecy, it could be worse. Narratively, I think it'd be unsatisfying for the main route if instead of Susie needing to take action to defy the prophecy, it turns out we were never following it to begin with just by virtue of her being there, and also because we didn't take these extremely specific steps to torture Noelle in Chapter 2. Outside of the weird route, I do think the idea of her being the girl has some merit. She can apparently equip the Jingle Sword, although that is her pencil, and interestingly, the Black Shard. And admittedly, Susie's general rebelliousness and desire to defy the prophecy could point to her not being in it to begin with. I'm not sure the ribbon thing holds up though, because Susie can equip ribbons. It's not the same as how there's character-specific weapons, she just refuses to wear them. But while the sword doesn't seem to suit Susie, the lack of antlers doesn't suit Noelle either. If anything, this image is purposefully kind of generic and distracting us from the fact that the prophecy can't count. We're told in order about the third hero, the first hero, and then at last was the girl, but after that, the girl with hope crossed on her heart is called the second hero. Since the last girl is explicitly represented with Rudebuster, maybe that's Susie's real role and Noelle really is the second hero. And then we have the door in Chapter 3's secret boss quest that has 4 triangles under the Deltarune. I've seen people say this is just a keyhole, but it does look identical to the other triangles, and I feel like a sprite as simple as this doesn't need a keyhole. In my very first video, I made a half-hearted aside, like, are there really 3 Delta warriors if the letter Delta means 4, only to be told by many people that Delta is a triangle, which is true, still means 4 though. So that makes me wonder, maybe the weird route isn't the true prophecy in comparison to the normal route, but simply a different way for it to be fulfilled. The old man talks all about reinterpreting stories after all. Maybe we can reinterpret the prophecy for better or for worse. Like, it wasn't wrong about Tenna being taken down, but as far as we know, it doesn't mention that he can be fixed, and we aren't necessarily contradicting the prophecy when we fix him. Maybe that's just wiggle room. Maybe the great irony of the weird route is that we commit these atrocities to change the prophecy and make our choices matter, but still end up following it. Only in the main route can we eventually be free. I don't know how to segue from that, but Suselle is real. Susie is constantly oscillating between seeming fully aware and engaged in their flirtation and being completely oblivious, but it's real. I love that Noelle's the one who actually brings up going to the festival at first, but I think an important part of her arc from here will be continuing to express herself without relying on Susie's help. Like, Susie shouting at Carol that she was going with Noelle probably did not make Carol less angry. Susie pretty clearly meant it as a date in that line, like the festival has largely romantic connotations, but she's also previously said that she wants to hang out with Kris as well, so I wonder if there'll be an option to third wheel them that, like, Susie will be cool with and Noelle will be very irritated by. The fact that them getting together as part of the prophecy is really interesting though. Frankly, I think that might not be a great thing for them. I feel like they should stick to building their relationship on organic grounds and not divine ordainment. Also, Noelle's sister is the knight who is like a huge foil to Susie, so that might cause some complicated feelings, just like in general. Speaking of not Suselle, weird route, huh? At the end of chapter 2, it looked like Noelle was headed towards trying to fight the player, but now she's decidedly more under our control than ever before. I think due to the thorn ring having a trance effect, but also the new visuals possibly indicate that we're messing with her soul somehow. I was really into the idea of Noelle resisting us more, but still self-sabotaging as a result, so this is a pretty different direction. At the same time, I'm very curious how her personality will change from here since she's now thankful for the weird route. It is a natural escalation of how the route increases her quote-unquote confidence, but in a twisted way. Like, she has that weird route monologue where she's like, this is good, I'm taking things for myself, but now she's actually convinced of it. But Noelle's not necessarily going to stay under her trance. For one, Susie is definitely catching on that something's wrong. She still hasn't talked about what exactly happened in Noelle's room despite saying she would, so I think that will come up at some point when she's like, seriously, why is Noelle acting so weird? Because Noelle and Kris being an item suddenly will probably also contribute to her suspicions. I was pretty surprised that you can still abort the weird route in chapter 4. I doubt we'll be able to after this, the thorn ring scene seems pretty final, but now that means you do in fact get to kill Berdly with no consequences. Okay, he's comatose, but that sucks. That one bit where you can't respond to Susie suggests the weird route is still on its creepypasta glitches shit, and since everything else snaps back to normal, I wonder if Berdly will, like, magically get better, since the game always forces itself back on script kind of illogically when you abort the route. Apparently though, if you finish the weird route in chapter 2, regardless of whether or not you continue it, there is a 3% chance of getting flavor text where Kris thinks of him in the Jackenstein fight, so, okay. Speaking of Berdly, that's probably the 50th time I've said speaking of in this video, I did expect things to still be rocky with him since he thinks the Dark World was a dream, but he did backtrack on his development a little more than I thought he would based on his 2 Light World lines at the end of chapter 2, particularly in that he's going after Noelle still, who we know he isn't into, and also Susie now. He needs that Arrow Ace arc so badly. He still seems to earnestly like Kris and Susie even if he's trying to pretend otherwise though, and it's nice that him hurting his arm seems to have consequences. And you know what? If you interact with him on the phone, he hits on Kris regardless of what option you choose, so Berdly wins. I feel like the idea of him being a bit neglected by the adults around him also still holds up. We meet Miss Boom, who thinks highly of him and forgets his name in the same sentence, and no sign of any parents even when he ends up in a coma. Even if he's pretty minor now, I do think he'll have a small role to play in future Light World segments, aside from the possibility of a quote-unquote date with him at the festival. Noelle needs to be more honest with him, like she said, and he's going to need to realize that Suselle is real. This is unlikely, but I still hope he tries to wingman for them. Get it, wingman, because he needs to make up for that it's a bro thing line. Also, these chapters have brought a resurgence in fandom jokes about how they're never finishing that damn project, and I can't imagine that won't be a gag at the end of the game, so maybe Berdly's re-redemption will be him doing both projects by himself. Another character in a similar position to Berdly, in that they're both friends of Noelle's who kind of restrict her agency, is Caddy, which makes total sense that she wasn't in the Chapter 4 Dark World. That's literally the prophecy world. That wouldn't have worked, but they totally played us with that Jockington grows the beard screenshot, and I'm mourning. But hear me out. Next chapter is the Festival/Flower King. The garden becomes an inferno of jealousy, very likely refers to Asgore, but additionally, who's jealous of Noelle's relationship with Susie? It's not gonna happen. She doesn't have a voice split, but it could. It could. She doesn't have to be as major as Berdly, just please do something with her, please. What will probably happen is Noelle in Chapter 5's Dark World, again, Festival, and also it's just been 2 chapters, girl, get back here. We may never get a Ralsei-Toriel interaction, but I genuinely think she will talk to Ralsei now that she acknowledged him in Chapter 4, and also because he's starting to become his own person and thus be cured of his forgettable curse. Like, it's mostly as a marketable plushie, but Tenna acknowledges his existence, which is perhaps related to his connection to the Dreamers or Kris making the fountain, and the old man talks to him like a person a few times and doesn't want to step on him. We're seeing great improvements here. A couple other things I forgot to mention and I'm shoving at the end of the video. I have no idea why it's so dangerous for Toriel to be awake in Chapter 3 or why she's a trump card for Tenna's deal with the Knight, because I don't think she has anything to do with the codes. Why would the Deltarune symbol represent her specifically as opposed to, like, Alvin? Lots of people in Hometown are religious. Why does the Knight try and fail to beam her but is able to kidnap Undyne super easily? Was she just there as bait for Susie, but then, like, the Knight wanted to stall the heroes, possibly until Undyne got there, so baiting Susie wouldn't be helpful? I don't know what's going on, but my point is, tutorial plot relevance can still be real. Genuinely, my biggest critique of these chapters is that there is a 500% decrease in shop sprites. I get why Ram doesn't have one that's like a part of his character that he's not actually supposed to be relevant, but like, give El Niño and La Niño a shop, that'd be cute. I want to hear them talk more. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I do plan to make proper video essays on these chapters in the future, but we'll see when that happens. I also want to focus on things like touching grass and drawing, and I'm low-key trying to make a game, but yeah, I'm looking forward to this new era.